Welcome to Talking Feds One-on-One, deep dive discussions with national figures about the most fascinating and consequential issues defining our culture and shaping our lives. I'm your host, Harry Littman. Welcome to another Talking Feds One-on-One. We are moving and quickly into a new period of defense of democracy and resistance to its antagonists. It's a longer slog with bigger challenges, and no one has sounded the alarm more loudly or been 100% on the case than our current guest today. Every time I introduce him, it sounds like I am talking in heroic terms, but that's because he is a hero, not just in educating the public, but really on the ground efforts to push back against some of the nastiest anti-democratic moves that are occurring. That, of course, would be Marc Elias, the firm chair of Elias Law Group, a mission-driven firm committed to helping Democrats win, citizens vote, and progressives make change. Marc, as always, thanks so much for being with us to give us the latest tragic reports.
Harry, I love talking to you on your podcast, and I love talking to you off your podcast, so it's great to be back.
All right. Thanks very much. Okay, the biggest point, I think, there's a really vivid and consequential, nasty theft being attempted in plain daylight in North Carolina, where voters reelected Justice Allison Riggs, a Democrat, to the state Supreme Court, which I think gives them the balance of power, and Republicans are just pulling a kind of 2020 move with different stratagems to just try to undo the result and install one Jefferson Griffin. Can you just give us the basic lay of the land and the current state of play with the litigation?
Yeah, I think you're exactly right in how you framed it about in reference to 2020. Because what you need to know here is that in North Carolina, they elect their Supreme Court justices, not necessarily a practice that I love and probably not one that Harry you love. And they elect them on partisan bases. That is the Republican legislature of North Carolina required. They used to be nonpartisan elections. Now they're partisan elections. So when we talk about Allison Riggs being the Democrat or the other candidate being the Republican, that's because that's actually how they run.
The D is on the ballot, right?
Yeah, it's on the ballot. So what you need to know is that very close election in 2024 in this race. At the end of the counting of the ballots, Allison Riggs, the incumbent Democrat, was ahead by a few hundred votes. There was then a recount, and it confirmed her victory. And then there was a second partial recount. This is what they refer to as a hand-to-eye recount. You could think of it as a partial hand recount. They want to see if any numbers change. No numbers change. So she won the election by just under 750 votes out of millions cast. And what happened next, and this is what I think is really important, is it's not that Griffin Jefferson, the Republican, said, okay, I think there were like 800 votes that should have been counted this way or that way. No. He and the Republican Party at the state level and the national level have filed a series of complaints and lawsuits to disqualify 60,000 voters. 60,000. Now, this would be the largest disenfranchisement in the post-election that I can think of going back, however. It is reminiscent of the scope and the scale of efforts that Donald Trump tried in 2020 when he was roundly condemned across the spectrum or in the media, wherever in all areas of sort of responsible commentary was condemned. And yet this is largely going on in North Carolina now with very, very little attention paid to it. And we're talking about disqualifying ballots, not because the voter did anything wrong, but rather most of these are because they are saying that the voter followed the law, followed the forms that were given to them. But the Republican Party now, in retrospect, thinks that those forms were illegal or the law was unconstitutional.
What makes it so challenging and interesting is that basically there's this short time period and then the books are closed. So it's sort of understood that there's no way of revisiting. I always think of the notorious butterfly ballot in Palm Beach and Teresa Lepore in 2000, which in some ways this feels a little bit like the narrowness of the margin. That principle doesn't exist in law or doesn't exist in North Carolina, or Jefferson Griffin is just trying to get the courts to ignore the principle?
So I think he's trying to get them to ignore that principle along with many, many others. I think that
Mm-hmm.
there is kind of a two-part strategy that they have here, or a two-part objective they have. For him, he wants to win the election, right? And the way I think he thinks they'll do that is not actually by saying she lost and he won, but rather ordering a new election, saying basically you had all of these people vote who should not have been allowed to vote, and therefore they need to call a new election.
All right. So he understands you can't zap them ex post facto, I guess.
I don't know that he would say that, but I think
Okay.
that's what he's thinking. I think,
Okay.
though, that the thing why this is more important than just that one race, obviously, state Supreme Court justice race is an important enough reason to discuss it in its own right. But I think the important reason why the RNC is bringing litigation, because the RNC itself is in some of these cases, and the Republican State Party is in a number of these cases, is that they are actually trying to vindicate a larger principle. And that is the big lie. That is the election denialism that they tried in 2020 that Donald Trump is obsessed with. They were told in 2020 that essentially you cannot, after the election, throw out all of the votes in Pennsylvania. You cannot, after the fact, throw out 20, 30,000 votes in Wisconsin.
11,980 in Georgia. What? Yeah.
Precisely, right? And Georgia, right? Specifically in Georgia, right? And so they view this, I think, beyond this one race as vindicating this principle that Donald Trump has been smarting over. And so they're trying to get it to bite. Now, so far they have been unsuccessful.
Well, wait, and not only vindicate it, but be able to use it, I would think, as a spear going forward. Yeah.
Absolutely, as a spear going forward. Yeah. And I think that the fact is, they so far have not been able to get anyone to bite on this. The courts that have reviewed it have rejected. There's just a case out of Wake County, which is the county that Raleigh, the capital, is in, that rejected this. But they think their best shot is to get to the state Supreme Court, which is majority Republican and a very partisan Republican majority. Kind of like what you used to remember the Wisconsin State Supreme Court used to be very partisan conservative, very ideologically conservative. This is a very partisan Republican court. And that court has had several efforts taken away from it because of what's referred to as removal jurisdiction, essentially because it implicates federal constitutional principles. They've wound up in federal court. But there's one petition that was filed as an original action, which means that they went straight to the state Supreme Court, and the state Supreme Court issued a stay on certification or on swearing in. So right now, Justice Riggs sits on that court as a holdover whose term has expired, but the state Supreme Court has put on hold the final certification of that election and her swearing in. And that is what we all need to be keeping an eye on.
You mentioned removal jurisdiction and the federal constitutional potential overlay. So now, in defending, is this contemplated that if they are in the bag for Griffin, there's a play to, I guess, the U.S. Supreme Court, unless in the same way you and she are filing original actions or whatever? What's the basic pushback, and to what extent and how does it involve federal law?
It involves federal law for two reasons. First of all, one of the categories of voters who they are trying to explicitly disenfranchise are military and overseas voters. As incredible as that is going to sound,
the bastards!
It is wild to me to even say it. The Republicans used to be the bastion of protecting military voters abroad. They attacked them in several cases before the election, and in this one they're attacking them here in North Carolina.
And Trump himself.
Yes.
Yeah. All right.
Yeah.
Anyway, so go ahead.
So that's a federal question, which, as you know, gets you in federal court. But the broader thing is that the retroactive application of a law, essentially saying that after people voted, that the state had induced them to vote illegally and therefore their ballot should be thrown out, implicates a federal constitutional right, which is the right to vote, even though it is a state election. So I think it's properly removed. Justice Riggs's lawyers think it's properly removed. The trial court said it was not.
From the state Supreme, you mean the original action is?
Yes. Yeah.
I see. So that's part of what's going on now.
Correct.
And where does it stand?
And so the trial court, interestingly, said, yeah, maybe it is a federal question, but I'm going to prudentially let it go to the state Supreme Court anyway. That's before the Fourth Circuit. And so the Fourth Circuit will have to decide whether or not removal was appropriate or not. And if it's removed to federal court, I think that this will probably all go away. And if it stays in state Supreme Court, we will see what happens, but we all need to keep an eye on it.
And if it happens bad, then potentially federal claims are made on direct appeal to the
Correct.
U.S. Supreme Court. Good luck with that, but okay.
I just want to add one quick thing that you said, which is for the non-lawyers out there, because I feel like we
So,
owe
I'm
them
sorry. Yeah.
I feel like we owe them an obligation here, Harry.
Don't you
This is
think?
not how the judicial system is supposed to work. Like the judicial system is not supposed to work that if you're the Republicans and you don't like the outcome of an election, you get to file 3, 4, 5 cases. Right? You don't get to claim split. You don't get to plaintiff, like you don't get to do all of these things where you just keep getting endless, the same theory just recycled through different levels of courts. You don't typically get to file cases originally in the state Supreme Court because you don't like the trial
Yeah.
courts. Like, we have become inured to, because of Donald Trump, to a lot of things that are highly irregular in the courts that I'm afraid that people who are not lawyers think, well, this is all just crazy that this works out this way.
Yeah, I mean, it really is grievous, and it is one of the strong arguments that, as you mentioned up front, and I do concur against elected judges. But there are states now. I mentioned Georgia, and my sense of it is very shamefully for it. When something's going forward, the first thing you want to know in that royal purple, but very red and very blue state is what's the party affiliation of the judges and justices. But yes, all you non-lawyers out there, this is aberrant, as with so much of Trump's tenure. Let me ask you, though, it may be aberrant, but is it general? I mean, we've always, when you think about elections, you wonder about the overall, close elections cushions. And, at the get out the vote stage or whatever, do you now counsel your clients, we better build in an extra 0.5% for the post-election kind of dirty trick factor to really, insulate? Do you see this as now just a kind of part of a playbook that, at least for the time being, even though it shouldn't be that way, is endemic?
Look, I was very vocal about this after 2020, going into the 2022 election, and then talked to you and others about this going into 2024. We have to understand that the Republicans are going to try to make it harder to vote and easier to cheat.
And by the way, you say Republicans. Are these basically the MAGA contingent
Yes,
in North
correct.
Carolina? Yeah. All right. So go ahead. Sorry.
Right. Now, query how much non-MAGA contingent is left in a lot of these states. But we have to assume that, part of their playbook is, pass voter suppression laws, try to make it harder for people to vote. And you have to build that reality into your campaigns. The fact is everyone right now is saying, well, the results of the election, free and fair elections are X, Y, and Z. And believe me, I came out right after the election and said Donald Trump won the election. So like, I'm not
Right.
saying anything different today.
You're not crazy.
I do think, though, that, we should not forget that, there was just a report that in Ohio, 7,000 voters were unable to vote because of their new ridiculously stringent ID law. Now, that would not have changed the election in the Senate race, wouldn't have changed the election in the presidential race. But I do think, to answer your question, you do have to start to build in the reality that some of these voting laws have to who is able to vote and who's not able to vote. And now you get to the second part, which is the post-election. And again, it is not to say that Democrats are held to a different standard. Democrats don't have to win by a point and Republicans have to only win by one vote. That's not fair. But I think you do have to account for the reality of what the post-election will look like, which is that if Republicans win, they will say everything was fine. And if Republicans lose, they'll say everything was cheated.
Fair enough. And you don't have to, but I do think it's the case that one side is playing dirty and one side is, trying to respond, but they're not at least propagating lies. Okay, just to wrap this up, the feel that I get from you, Mark, is you're sounding the canary in a coal mine alarm because it's truly outrageous. But it would still, if you gun to your head, betting person, you think probably justice will prevail, or is it really a toss-up question now?
No, look, I think Justice Riggs is going to get sworn back into that court and is going to serve a year term. What I want people to know, though, is that if you believed that the threat of these kinds of post-election cases to disenfranchise tens of thousands of voters on really, really outrageous theories are over, they're not over. Like, that is still with us. That part of election annihilism is still strong in the MAGA gene.
Yeah, I mean, and I think that's part of building for the future for them. And I should have mentioned you have a really great YouTube channel on Democracy Doc, and you mentioned the tactics are far from over, and that this is really coming up almost sort of state by state. So we'll leave it here for now with one asterisk, which is on voter suppression laws. We have, I think, as one of the priorities formulated by Mike Johnson and his service to Donald Trump, a comprehensive, let's call it what it is, voter suppression law at the federal level that could be really pernicious. If and when that's introduced, maybe we can come talk about it. But for now, okay, so Justice Riggs, we hope justice will prevail, and we will, as you say, hopefully watch it carefully.
Talking Feds is supported by the Brennan Center for Justice. In this new political era, the Brennan Center will do what they do best: defend the Constitution and the rule of law. They're prepared to fight against presidential overreach and will continue advocating for reforms to resist weaponized government, stop billionaires from corrupting our elections, and ensure every eligible American has the freedom to vote. Stay informed by visiting BrennanCenter.org.
I wanted to talk about something broader that I know interests you, well, much interests you, even apart from election, but it feels like a kind of moment in media. I'm involved in it somewhat, as you probably know, you do know because you were so kind to me about it. I resigned from the LA Times yesterday. Jen Rubin resigned from the Washington Post and has started a kind of new Substack that I'm a founding contributor for, The Contrarian, with a really impressive slate of folks involved. But it just feels like it's a time when, among all the other unsettling developments, major legacy media outlets, perhaps because so many of them are part of corporate consortiums that the board of directors worry more broadly than about the paper and kowtowing to Trump. But there seemed to be a real thrust out there to make coverage less antagonistic to Trump, not out of a feeling that it's been imbalanced on the facts or according to journalism's traditional role, but just, well, let me serve that up to you. Do you agree? Why is it? And how serious do you think it is?
Yeah. So look, I think we have to disaggregate two things that are going on, both of which are seismic. The first is the legacy media's complete moral collapse around Donald Trump. And you, frankly, have understated your role here. You are one of the true heroes of this era. Like, the fact is, when the LA Times turned into something unrecognizable from the former LA Times, you didn't just complain about it. You didn't just, post on social media about it. You left the LA Times, and you deserve an enormous, enormous amount of respect and credit.
Thank you.
And support for that. And so that's one piece of the story, right? Which is what is happening to the Washington Post, the LA Times, the large media conglomerates. They are capitulating to Donald Trump. And the reason is really simple, which is that they have business interests their owners have business interests that far extend beyond the newspapers. The paradigm that we had in mind was that an outlet like the one that I founded, Democracy Docket, would have to be more cautious because it was small and could get crushed by Donald Trump. But an outlet like the LA Times or the Washington Post, it could be bold and brave because it had billionaires behind it. It turns out that is exactly the reverse. It turns out that because Jeff Bezos wants to launch rockets, because he wants to sell server space or whatever it is that Amazon does with the federal government, he is more beholden to Donald Trump. It turns out that Disney, because of all of their interests, their licensing interests, their television stations and their theme parks or whatever else, they are more beholden to Donald Trump and government than the small independent media outlets are. So that's kind of one thing that is going on. The second, though, which I want everyone to pay attention to, and it goes, frankly, to your success as a great example, which is that there are people like me who, frankly, with all due respect, I don't necessarily want to read the LA Times. I live in Washington, D.C. I subscribe to the Wall Street Journal. I subscribe to the New York Times. I subscribe to the Washington Post. But I do want to read you. And so the ability to say, you know what, there is this place where not only am I not supporting legacy media that I don't believe in and all of that, but I can get predictable, steady stream of someone who is super smart and very insightful is also important in the cultural and political moment, because those voices are going to be part of what lead us forward. It is going to be people like you writing for yourself in your own voice. Not that you didn't do that in the LA Times, but you know what I mean? Like in your own Substack, that is so important, I think, to building what I refer to as a new opposition movement as we move forward. And it is something that the Republicans and conservative have understood for years. Look at what Ben Shapiro's done. Look at what Steve Bannon's done. Look at what Barry Weiss has done with the Free Press. You can hate these people. And sometimes I get hate because on social media, I'll say, look, this is really smart, what they're saying or doing. And people are like, I can't believe you support them. It's not that I support them. It's that I understand that Harry Litman, unfiltered through his Substack, which everyone should subscribe to, and if you can afford it, you should pay, that is actually more important to building the next opposition movement than, frankly, Harry Litman as part of a media conglomerate newspaper.
Well, first, that's really kind of you, and thanks. And it's kind of a corollary of something that people point out and are troubled by, which is the huge sort of silo movement. In media, there's so many different ones, but it does mean that you can have basically independent. I mean, we have no partners, no whatever. It's just us and me. And thanks very much to anyone who goes to the Talking Fed Substack and finds it useful. But there are those voices, and I think you're right. As this sort of happened in the judicial world, where the Republicans, they were just ahead of the game, did a great job, and Democrats were playing catch up and employing that sort of blueprint.
The reason why everyone needs to go right now and subscribe to Talking Fed on Substack is because of this. I'm not going to accuse you or your prior newspaper of ever censoring what you wrote. Okay. I'm assuming you had too much integrity for that, and they probably they knew that and wouldn't try it. But I know this: when I read what you write on Substack, there is no set of corporate venture capitalists or private equity people or business people. Like, it's just you talking to your readers. And that connection between you and those of us who read you and care what you have to say is such a different connection than it is when it is mediated through large media conglomerates. And like I said, you can hate the right wing. You can say, I think it's terrible what this person or that person's done, but that's what they understand. And it is what is one of the reasons why your podcast is so successful. Think about why your podcast is the most successful independent media podcast in the world, or at least on the left of center. Why is that? Because it's just you. There's not, I'm not getting, some corporate overlord.
And by the way, since we're saying it also has hardly any commercials for that reason. Look, it is true, and thank you, but there's a broader point to it as well. Even in a nice situation with LA Times, you write 1,000 words and may fit in. The Substack is my chance to, go long, sometimes be too prolific, sometimes be a little casual, a little vulgar, whatever. But it really is a direct relationship with the readers that just wouldn't happen on a main media. So thank you very much. Let me and because you're seeing, I think, not just on the editorial side where the real violence has been done to anti-Trump opinion, but kind of the news side. So you specifically talked about how the Post referred to Pam Bondi as qualified, and you see in general a kind of trend even in sort of standard news for a kowtowing or sucking up to Donald Trump. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, take a look at how the legacy media describes some of these nominees. And I'm not talking about, like you said, I'm not talking about the opinion pieces. I'm just saying, like,
Right.
take a look at how they describe them in the news pieces. Take a look at how they describe, frankly, January 6th now, 2021, how they describe, and I try to point these out on Blue Sky, which I post on, and I try to like show these headlines. And it's not to play a game of gotcha. I'm not like trying to be like, clever and say, oh, I mean, there are lots of accounts that do that. I'm actually just trying to show that the legacy media is in a business, and their owners of that business have other businesses. And like, that's just not what I'm for. That's not what Democracy Docket's about. Take a look at the coverage of how Democracy Docket has written about Pam Bondi and how the Washington Post has written about Pam Bondi. Democracy Docket covers Pam Bondi by starting with the fact that she was an election denier. That in 2020, she said that the Pennsylvania results were fraudulent. And like, how do you not start with that? How do you not end with that? She's nominated to be the Attorney General of the United States, for God's sake.
We are in some ways in a good moment in the history of media because independent voices, yesterday the Contrarian launched, and MSNBC and CNN covered it as an event. When I resigned from the LA Times, MSNBC and CNN covered it as an event. In other words, it's not these plucky, obscure, but the independent voices, if you find them, really are participating in the overall debate. And then it's really because the independent voices also seem to be the ones saying, and you are saying, and I am saying, if we're wrong, hooray for the country. But if we're right, really serious for the country, the stakes are immense. The early signs before Trump has even taken office are foreboding. And, if a few years from now we're writing a kind of post-mortem where the United States has started to look at it a lot like Hungary, it will be for these very points that you and I and independent folks, but not very much, the legacy media are screaming about. And just for people to be aware of them, and if they find it persuasive, be involved in pushback and from everything from the midterm elections to just Thanksgiving dinner conversation. That's really sort of with the huge power that Trump is about to inherit. That's kind of where it's at.
Yeah, and so I want to encourage your audience to take a page from what you did. The media is an essential component to democracy. For everything I say about the media and my criticisms of legacy media, it's called the fourth estate for a reason, right? It is a free press that is not just in theory free, but is acting as an independent check, is essential to a functioning democracy. And when that was threatened, you didn't just say, okay, I'll just do my thing. You didn't just keep your head down and keep writing, which you could have done, right? You could have been like, look, I have a circulation here. I'm just going to keep doing what I'm doing. You stood up. When other people took a step back, you took a step forward. And you said, I'm going to take this head on. I'm going to leave this very prestigious publication that I've been at for a long time. And I'm going to do something because I'm going to stand up for democracy. So every person listening, you have the chance to do that. When I talk about that everyone has a town square, Harry's town square is a big town square. It was a big, multinational newspaper. Now it's a very, very large Substack. But everyone out there has a town square. It may not be as big as his, may not be as big as mine, but you all have a town square. And so the next time you are at that dinner table, the next time you're talking to coworkers or friends or family, and they are saying something that is not true, they're lying about what's causing the terrible fires in LA, or they are spreading disinformation about immigrants, or they're spouting Donald Trump's talking points. Think about what Harry did, right? Think about what he did. Take a step forward. Don't back away. Confront it. Say it's not right. It's not right to demonize our fellow citizens. It's not right to somehow say that, our fellow citizens are seeing their houses burned and that we are going to lie about it. It's not right that Donald Trump is going to demonize the weakest among us. Take a step forward and say in your town square that you are going to stand up for what is right. You're going to stand up for democracy. Because if Harry Litman can do that in his arena, I sure as hell you can do it in yours. And I think if we all do that, if we all learn that lesson, then I think we're going to be okay over the next 4 years. If people, on the other hand, do what legacy media is doing and back away, that's where I start to worry.
And thank our good fortune that we can still do it and hope that we'll be able to. And by the way, you can come visit our town squares as well. You're always welcome. Marc Elias, it's such a pleasure as always to speak with you, especially during these trying times. Hope we'll do it again soon.
Anytime.
Thank you for tuning in to One on One, a weekly conversation series from Talking Feds. If you like what you've heard, please tell a friend to subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts or wherever they get their podcasts, and please take a moment to rate and review this podcast. You can also subscribe to us on YouTube, where we post full episodes, talking books, and bonus video content. Talking Feds remains one of the very few independent productions out there, so if you like the work we do and are inclined to support the show, joining our Patreon is the best way to do it. Plus, you'll get tons of perks like free access to my LA Times op-eds and the chance to join monthly live Q&A sessions. Thanks for tuning in, and don't worry, as long as you need answers, the Feds will keep talking. Talking Feds One-on-One is produced by Catherine Devine, associate producer Gabriella Glick, sound engineering by Matt McArdle, Rosie Dawn Griffin, Hamza Mehendranathan, David Lieberman, and Emma Maynard are our contributing writers. Production assistance by Akshaj Turbailu and Genesis Magpayo. Our music, as ever, is by the amazing Philip Glass. Talking Feds is a production of Delito LLC. I'm Harry Littman. Talk to you later.